An airplane is the safest means of transportation. Unfortunately, even today, some of them can crash. But what modern passenger planes cannot do is disappear without a trace or reason. And yet, the story of Flight MH370 exists. On the night of March 8, 2014, a Boeing 777 takes off from the airport of Malaysia's capital. Destination, Beijing, China. It is a regular daily flight of Malaysia Airlines. On board are over 200 passengers and crew members. 30 minutes after takeoff, the captain makes his last contact with the ground. 40 minutes later, the Boeing will disappear not only from the radars but entirely, along with 200 passengers. As a result, this case will become one of the main mysteries in aviation history.
Breaking news tonight, a Malaysia Airlines flight with 239 people on board, including 4 Americans, has gone missing.
A 17-minute gap from when Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 disappeared. How could Malaysian officials lose track of this plane?
Someone in the cockpit deliberately moved the aircraft to specific waypoints before it disappeared.
We have no idea where the plane has ended up.
MH370 are presumed to have lost their lives.
We believe family members should prepare themselves for the worst.
Several countries will participate in the investigation and search for the aircraft. Several years and hundreds of millions of dollars will be spent. Yet to this day, no one, from official authorities to conspiracy theorists, can give a definitive answer. What happened? Was the plane hijacked? Was it a terrorist attack? Did the equipment fail? Did the captain take his own life? Was the plane struck by lightning or a meteorite? Was it shot down by the military? 10 years have passed, and no one knows what happened to it. In this video, we will try to unravel the mystery of the missing Boeing. We will trace the entire flight chronology, study reports, analyze theories, and understand where the truth is most likely hidden. The model of the missing plane is Boeing 777. It is one of the largest and most advanced types of airliners in the world. March 8, 2014. It is a quiet, clear night. The Boeing 777 is preparing to take off from the airport of Malaysia's capital, Kuala Lumpur. Destination, Beijing, China. This is a daily flight for Malaysia Airlines. About 5.5 hours of flight time. The forecast predicts good weather conditions throughout the entire flight. Only a few areas of turbulence are expected, but this is not an issue for modern aircraft. The captain of Flight MH370 is Zahari Ahmad Shah. He is 53 years old and has spent more than 30 years flying with Malaysia Airlines, including on the Boeing 777 model, a highly experienced specialist with an impeccable professional reputation. The second pilot is Farik Abdul Hamid, 27 years old. His experience is modest, just 4 years. For Farik, this is a training flight on the Boeing 777 model, on which he has made only a few flights. Nevertheless, the fact that this young man was entrusted with the co-pilot seat on a large airliner indicates good professional qualities. Besides the 2 pilots, there were 10 crew members on board, each with extensive experience ranging from 10 to 30 years. There were 227 passengers on board from various countries around the world.
Malaysian 370.
Malaysian 370, Lumpur, radar, good morning, climb flight level 250.
Morning, level 250, Malaysian 370.
Another important detail that deserves attention is the timing. At 12:40 a.m., Captain Zahari receives permission for takeoff.
370, 32 right of takeoff. Nice.
At 1:01 a.m., the Boeing climbs to a cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. Cruising altitude, in simple terms, is the level at which the aircraft spends most of its flight.
Malaysian 370, maintaining level 350.
The captain's voice sounds calm and relaxed. His communication with the ground controller is proceeding as planned. MH370 is clearly visible to all radars, and the flight is proceeding in normal mode. Nothing suspicious. But just 7 minutes later, strange things will begin to happen. At 01:08 a.m., Captain Zahari informs the ground that the aircraft is at an altitude of 35,000 feet.
370, maintaining level 350.
The strange thing about this message is not its meaning, but the fact of its existence. 7 minutes earlier, the captain had already informed the ground that the aircraft was at an altitude of 35,000 feet. The second message was clearly unnecessary and suspicious. It could have appeared for several reasons, but we will discuss them a little later, because right after this message, truly surprising things begin to happen. 11 minutes later, flight MH370 is over the South China Sea. It leaves Malaysian airspace and enters Thailand's airspace. The Kuala Lumpur controller instructs Zahari to contact the Vietnamese controller from Ho Chi Minh and says goodbye.
Malaysian 370, contact Ho Chi Minh 120.9. Good night.
Zahari says goodbye in response.
Good night, Malaysian 370.
This message is interesting for two reasons. Firstly, the controller pronounced 5 digits during the farewell. This is the radio frequency. According to the rules, Zahari was supposed to repeat it, but he did not. Secondly, this message from the captain will be the last. The plane will not make contact with Vietnam. Almost immediately after this, the aircraft will disappear from radars. At that moment, one of the greatest mysteries in aviation history began. Of course, the first thought when a plane disappears from radars is that it simply crashed. However, as it turns out later, flight MH370 remained in the sky for many more hours. Moreover, the place where the aircraft became invisible to radars was, so to speak, ideal. The plane was no longer in Malaysian airspace and had not yet entered Vietnamese airspace. In other words, it was the perfect moment if someone wanted to make the plane invisible. Everything that happened to the aircraft after it disappeared from radars became the main subject of investigations, speculation, and conspiracy theories. We will rely on facts, and over the past 10 years, quite a few have accumulated. Throughout the entire flight, a passenger plane remains visible to radars. These radars are divided into two types. The first ones are the large vertically standing dishes. Roughly speaking, they send a signal in the direction of the aircraft and read the reflection from the object. This is somewhat outdated technology and therefore not very accurate in determining the plane's position or speed. In addition, these radars have a limited range. Today, most air traffic monitoring systems rely on the second type of radars. These receive information from transponders located on board the aircraft. The data includes the position, altitude, speed, and other indicators of the plane. This system is the basis for services like flight radar, where anyone can track passenger planes in real time anywhere in the world. The problem with this technology is the following. The aircraft will become invisible to such radars if the transponders on board fail or if someone turns them off. Now let's return to the events of that night. March 8, 2014. What was happening on the ground after flight MH370 disappeared from radars? At first, the controller in Kuala Lumpur did not notice anything unusual. Apparently, he was busy with other aircraft at that moment. When he finally discovered that MH370 was no longer on the radars, he assumed that the plane was already outside his jurisdiction in Vietnamese airspace. At the same time, Vietnamese controllers recorded that flight MH370 entered their airspace and then disappeared from radars. According to regulations, they should have contacted their colleagues in Kuala Lumpur within 5 minutes if the captain of MH370 did not establish contact with them. However, the Vietnamese did not do this. Instead, they unsuccessfully tried to contact the aircraft for almost 20 minutes. Only after that did they report the information to the Malaysians. The controllers in Kuala Lumpur, in turn, contacted Malaysia Airlines and they responded that everything was normal. According to their data, the plane was flying as planned over Cambodia. As it turned out later, such data were based not on the actual position of the aircraft, but on a preliminary flight plan that the airline had. Around 2:00 a.m., all parties agreed that the flight was proceeding as planned, and none of them noticed a barely detectable signal from those very old-school radars. According to them, the aircraft was indeed continuing its flight, but in a completely different direction from the planned one. Due to the controller's inattention, no one notified the Malaysian aviation authorities about the plane's disappearance within an hour, as required by regulations. It took another 4 hours. Only when MH370 did not land at the scheduled time in Beijing did the situation become critical, and the aircraft was declared missing. The search for the aircraft began in the South China Sea. This was logical since the connection with the airliner was lost there. Several dozen aircraft and ships from Malaysia and Vietnam searched the maritime area. However, no traces of MH370 were found. Only a few days after the disappearance, thanks to radar data from the first type and military radar data, it became clear that MH370 first made a sharp, almost 180-degree turn between Vietnam and Malaysia, crossed Malaysian territory, bypassed Indonesia, and abruptly turned south. After that, it flew for several more hours and eventually disappeared. The aircraft's flight path suggested one thing. It was not an accident or a technical failure. It was almost certainly a well-planned operation. But why? For what purpose? And where are the plane and the 200 passengers? Finding a needle in a haystack is not easy, but the real problem is when you don't even know where the haystack is. This roughly describes the situation faced by the Malaysian authorities when it became clear that the Boeing 777 did not fall into the South China Sea. Moreover, the initial information about the strange flight path of MH370 did not come from official sources, but from journalists. Only after that did the Malaysian authorities confirm the accuracy of the media reports. Sometime later, the London-based company Inmarsat became involved in the incident. They specialize in commercial satellites, and passenger aviation is not their primary field. However, in this situation, it turned out that satellite data from Inmarsat, combined with ground radar data, could likely reconstruct the entire flight path of MH370 and at the same time rule out several of the most obvious versions of what had happened. The entire flight path of the Boeing can be divided into two parts. The first part is known thanks to civilian and military radars, while the second part was reconstructed using satellite data. The route of the first part of the flight, 40 minutes before the transponders were turned off and another hour after, is beyond doubt. And here's why it matters. The most obvious version of what happened initially suggested an emergency situation. Some systems failed, or there was a fire, or some other emergency situation disabled the very transponders on board that transmit information to the ground. Similar cases have happened before. In 2010, a cargo Boeing 747 operated by UPS crashed in Dubai due to a fire on board. The investigation found that the fire was caused by lithium batteries that the aircraft was carrying as cargo. In 1998, a Swissair passenger plane crashed over Canada due to a short circuit that caused a fire and the failure of critical systems. Flight MH370 also carried cargo. Part of it was lithium batteries. As the investigation later established, they could not have caused a fire or crash because they were properly packed. But the main argument against the theory of a fire on board due to cargo or a short circuit is the flight trajectory and other details. The point is that at the very moment the transponders were turned off and the plane disappeared from the radar, it did not happen all at once. One part of the transponder functionality was disabled first, and 37 seconds later, they were completely disabled. This means that the cause was not a sudden situation like a fire or explosion, but a manual, gradual shutdown of the transponders, most likely from the cockpit. Moreover, the sharp 180-degree turn from the original route indicates that it was performed manually. It could not have been the autopilot. Subsequent tests showed that the plane on autopilot cannot make such a sharp turn. Let's assume a fire occurred on board, disabling the transponders, and the pilots turned back to make an emergency landing. But they did not do that. They continued flying further. Moreover, in that first part of the route reconstructed by radar, the plane remained manually controlled. This is evidenced by minor lateral deviations during the flight. This, in turn, rules out the version of the pilots losing consciousness, for example, due to smoke or cabin depressurization. According to satellite data from Inmarsat, the second part of the flight was reconstructed after MH370 disappeared from ground radar. According to these data, the Boeing continued to fly at high speed and high altitude towards Antarctica for another 6 hours before finally disappearing in the southern part of the Indian Ocean. However, this information was not immediately known. Because of this, the searches were conducted in completely wrong locations and, of course, yielded no results. Additionally, time was lost. If the Malaysian authorities had immediately disclosed information about the plane's strange flight path, it might have been possible to find it. That is also why many people, including some relatives of the missing Boeing's passengers, believe that the Malaysian authorities are covering up the true cause of what happened, that the plane might not have crashed at all or was shot down. We will discuss these theories a bit later. For now, let's focus on the search operation. It stretched over several years and, according to some estimates, became the most expensive and extensive search operation in history. Planes and ships from several countries combed hundreds of square miles over 2 months, first in the South China Sea, then in the Andaman Sea, where the plane was last seen by radar. Finally, the search moved to the southern part of the Indian Ocean, where, according to Inmarsat data, the plane finally disappeared. After 2 months of unsuccessful attempts, the search operation shifted to underwater exploration. Due to a lack of resources to study the depths of the Indian Ocean in the presumed area, the Malaysians involved the Australians with more advanced equipment. Their main goal was to find the black boxes from the cockpit. Several years were spent. Hundreds of square kilometers of seabed were examined. The cost exceeded $100 million. Nevertheless, nothing was found. Sometime later, the American commercial company Ocean Infinity continued the search. Under an agreement with the Malaysian authorities, the searchers would receive a reward only if the search was successful. However, after several months of exploring the seabed in the presumed crash area in the southern Indian Ocean, nothing was found. In July 2015, 16 months after the disappearance of the plane, street cleaners on the island of Réunion in the Indian Ocean discovered a strange object. Later, it was identified as a part of the wing of a Boeing 777, known as a flaperon. Thanks to the serial numbers on the flaperon, it became evident that this was a piece not just from any Boeing 777, but from MH370 itself. Subsequently, on the coast of Madagascar and nearby coastal territories, a total of about 20 fragments of a Boeing 777 were found. Only a few of them could be precisely identified as fragments of MH370, while others were classified by experts as most likely belonging to the missing plane. However, the discovered fragments did not reveal anything new about what had happened. Based on satellite data, it was almost certainly clear that the plane fell in the southern part of the Indian Ocean. An analysis of currents in this region only confirmed that the debris would likely be carried to the southeastern part of Africa. No traces of explosion or fire were found on the fragments, which only reinforced the theory that what happened to flight MH370 was orchestrated by a human. In 2018, a massive report with the results of the incident investigation was published by the Malaysian authorities. The 450-page document mostly duplicated technical specifications and features of the Boeing 777, the results of search operations, and radar data. The conclusion of the document stated that it was impossible to determine the true causes of the plane's disappearance. However, even in this generally useless document, the authors admitted that the disabling of transponders and other detection systems on board the plane was most likely the work of a human. And we we remember that the disabling of these systems and the subsequent sharp turn of the aircraft occurred in the most ideal location to make the plane invisible. But who did it? And most importantly, why? Over the years of investigating the incident, numerous theories have emerged. Some of them were based on existing facts and calculations. Such theories were often put forward by former or current pilots or other aviation professionals. They carefully analyzed radar data, relied on their own experience, and many of these arguments have either already been heard or will be discussed during this video. However, at the same time, many other theories appeared. These can be called speculative or conspiratorial. Some of them even became the basis for major documentaries about MH370, including on platforms like Netflix. One of the conspiracy scenarios suggests that MH370 was originally shot down by the US military from the Diego Garcia base in the Indian Ocean. Either because the aircraft was initially aiming to attack this base, or because the military shot down an unresponsive unknown passenger plane. Subsequently, many radar data and debris were allegedly deliberately falsified to conceal what happened. Another scenario even claims that after turning over Indonesia, the plane flew not to the south but to the north and crashed somewhere over Kazakhstan. The problem with these theories is that they are contradicted by the numbers. In the professional aviation community, and we are talking about specialists from different countries, there is no significant disagreement about the MH370 route, which was calculated mathematically using various satellites and radars. But what even experienced pilots cannot say for sure is what actually happened to flight MH370. There are different versions. Now we will look at them in detail. So what we already know, based on the flight trajectory, satellite data, and radar information, is that most likely we are dealing with a deliberate act. An equipment failure or human error cannot explain what happened. System glitches, icing, bird strikes, lightning, meteorites, volcanic ash clouds, mechanical failure, electronic failure, equipment malfunction, fire with smoke, explosion, depressurization, bomb, missile. None of this can explain the path taken by flight MH370. By the time the transponders were turned off, the aircraft was most likely controlled by one of the pilots. It is hard to believe they acted together since this was their first joint flight. This means that the pilot not in control at that moment either could not enter the cockpit because it was locked or was already unconscious. According to one version, the person at the controls, after the first sharp turn, climbed to an altitude of 40,000 feet, depressurizing the cabin in the process. Oxygen in passenger mass lasts only 10-15 minutes, meaning that everyone on board quickly lost consciousness. At the same time, oxygen in the cockpit mass for pilots lasts for several hours. Furthermore, at the moment the plane made a sharp course change, not only were the transponders turned off, but also some other electrical systems of the plane. It is unclear for what purpose, but probably to disable satellite communication systems and make the plane completely invisible to ground controllers. If this is the case, it means that for the remaining 6 hours of the flight, only one person remained alive on board, the one at the controls. One more fact supports this theory. Almost an hour later at 2:25 a.m., some electrical systems on the plane were reactivated, including those responsible for satellite connection. Partly thanks to this, the full flight path of the aircraft was later reconstructed. Along with the restoration of electrical systems, the cabin of the plane was repressurized. For everyone on board, except for the person at the controls, this made no sense. None of them would have been alive at that point. Thus, the question remains, who was at the controls? One of the pilots, or was the plane hijacked? Plane hijackings are not that uncommon, but unfortunately, they do happen. And besides these cases, there have been many similar incidents in aviation history. However, over time, security measures have continuously increased. Gaining access to the cockpit for unauthorized individuals is almost impossible. On the Boeing model in 2014, the cockpit door was equipped with multiple security layers, plus video surveillance to allow pilots to see who was at the door. Additionally, the first disappearance of the plane from the radar occurred just minutes after Captain Zahari casually said goodbye to the dispatcher. It is unlikely that a passenger could hijack the plane in such a short time. Moreover, the disappearance and sharp turn occurred at the most ideal moment, between the airspaces of two different countries. It is hard to imagine that hijackers could have chosen such a perfect moment, but let's assume that the hijackers still managed to enter the cockpit. For the captain or co-pilot to report this to the ground or send an appropriate signal would take only a few moments, but they did not do so. One of the theories about the hijacking of MH370 suggests that someone could have turned off the transponders and some systems by accessing the compartment under the floor in the cabin, where many systems and sensors are located. However, it is hard to imagine that this could have been done unnoticed by the more than 200 people on board. Additionally, a significant part of the incident investigation focused on examining the identities of all 239 people on board, including the crew members. In addition to the Malaysians, FBI officers also participated in this process. As a result, 2 passengers were found to have traveled with forged passports. However, further investigation revealed that these 2 passengers were Iranian nationals and had no ties to any terrorist organizations. Most likely, they were simply trying to reach a relatively safe country and then seek political asylum. Finally, what would be the motive for hijacking the plane? A terrorist attack? Money or politics? Everything that happened to MH370 during the 7-hour flight suggests that none of this was likely the reason. Moreover, no one has claimed responsibility for the incident. Anonymity is not typical for terrorists. Thus, we are left with very few theories. Essentially just one. The incident was orchestrated by one of the pilots. But who and why? Thus, we move on to discussing those who were originally at the controls of the plane. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah and co-pilot Farik Abdul Hamid. Pilots are not robots. Pilots are living people. Those at the controls can also experience psychological problems, go through difficult life situations, face financial difficulties, and so on. All of this could potentially become the reason why a pilot might hijack a plane or decide to end their life while performing professional duties. Examples from the history of civil aviation confirm this. In 2014, an Ethiopian Airlines plane with 200 passengers on board was hijacked by the co-pilot. The aircraft was flying from Ethiopia's capital to Milan, Italy. During the flight, the captain went to the restroom. The co-pilot locked the cockpit door and took control. He then landed in Switzerland and requested political asylum. None of the passengers were injured. In '99, an Egypt Air Boeing flying from New York to Cairo crashed into the ocean 30 minutes after takeoff. American investigators concluded that it was a deliberate act by the co-pilot, who turned off the engines and directed the plane downward. More than 200 people on board were killed. In 2015, a Germanwings plane flying from Barcelona to Dusseldorf suddenly began descending and crashed into the Alps. As later determined by the investigation, this was a deliberate action by the pilot. He locked the cockpit door after the captain left for the restroom and directed the plane downward. Nearly 150 people died. The cause of the co-pilot's actions was severe mental health issues that he had concealed from the airline. These are just a few examples, but there are many similar cases. Therefore, during the investigation, the pilots were scrutinized particularly thoroughly. Their biographies, medical records, relatives, bank accounts, homes, and apartments. The co-pilot was 27-year-old Farik Abdul Hamid. None of the details of his life indicated that he might commit a deliberate act of crashing the plane. His finances and health were in perfect order. He was described by acquaintances as an optimistic young man. Moreover, he was reportedly planning to get married soon. From a professional standpoint, everything was going well in Farik's life. As I mentioned, he had recently been entrusted with the co-pilot seat of a Boeing 777. This is a huge airliner, and being appointed to such a position at a young age is prestigious. His career prospects were excellent. The only suspicious detail regarding the co-pilot was his phone. The Malaysian investigators' report stated that after the plane made a sharp turn from the planned route, the co-pilot's iPhone unexpectedly activated. This happened over Penang Island, and the phone briefly connected to a cell tower. It was neither an outgoing nor an incoming call. The cell tower on the island only registered a connection with the device. What could this mean? According to regulations, pilots' phones must be turned off during the flight. This means that someone turned on the co-pilot's phone while in the air. Perhaps it was him trying to make a call or send a message. But this is only an assumption. The true reason for the brief connection between the ground and the co-pilot's phone remains unknown. Interestingly, the information about Freak's iPhone surfaced in the press due to a leak of materials from the Malaysian investigation. Many of these materials were never published and did not make it into the final 400-page report. Why? A curious question without a clear answer. The Malaysian authorities are indeed known for corruption and lack of transparency, but why conceal such facts remains unclear. In any case, we have no indirect evidence suggesting that the co-pilot intended to commit a deliberate act. Therefore, we move on to discussing the captain of the aircraft, Zahari Ahmad Shah. Let me remind you that Zahari Ahmad Shah was a very experienced pilot, 53 years old, with more than 30 years spent flying various Malaysia Airlines aircraft. Since 1998, Zahari had served as a captain on the Boeing 777 model. The pilot had an impeccable professional reputation. He was married with 3 children. As the investigation revealed, his finances and health were in good order. Colleagues described Zahari positively. He was resilient to stress. Before the flight, there was nothing suspicious in his behavior. Investigators also carefully analyzed the airport surveillance footage before the flight. His posture, facial expressions, and other indicators did not reveal any abnormalities. In his free time, Zahari was involved in amateur electronics and flew on a home flight simulator. Zahari even had his own YouTube channel.
Hi everyone, this is a YouTube video that I've made as a community service.
In short, the captain of the aircraft also did not seem to have any motives for committing such a terrible act. However, many details from the flight analysis pointed to the captain as the main suspect. The Malaysian authorities' report on the pilot raised many suspicions. The media started publishing articles claiming that the captain's personal life was complicated. He allegedly lived separately from his wife and had mistresses. However, it is worth noting that these rumors were not publicly confirmed by Zahari's relatives. What was truly strange was the flight simulator found in the pilot's house. The suspicious thing was not the presence of the device itself, but the flights Zahari performed on the simulator. Among the hundreds of saved and deleted flight data, investigators' attention was drawn to a route that ended in the southern part of the Indian Ocean, closely resembling the real MH370 route reconstructed from radar and satellite data. This suggests that the captain may have rehearsed this fateful flight on his simulator. As I have already noted, many aviation professionals agree that everything that happened with the Boeing was well prepared. What makes the simulator data even more suspicious is the fact that information about this flight was leaked to the press from a non-public Malaysian government report. They later admitted that the unusual route on the simulator did exist. Moreover, it had been deleted by Zahari himself and later restored by investigators. The official report of the Malaysian authorities concluded that it was not an attempt to rehearse the final flight of MH370. Some independent researchers also agree with this, considering it a coincidence. On the other hand, if it was not a coincidence, it means that Zahari indeed rehearsed the MH370 flight path. As independent researchers discovered, this particular simulator flight had no landing point, unlike hundreds of others. The general idea of a simulator is for the person at the controls to take off, reach the intended destination, and land at a specific airport. However, in this case, Zahari's simulator flight did not have a landing point. This makes one thing clear. The fact that Zahari was at some point the main suspect in the incident is completely understandable. However, we cannot say with certainty that he hijacked Flight MH370 and is responsible for its disappearance. We lack concrete evidence. We only have circumstantial conclusions. What is certain is that the person who did this was very well prepared and knew exactly what they were doing. Although data from several different researchers confirm the approximate crash zone in the Indian Ocean, we still do not have a precise answer about how the final phase of the flight went. Was it a gradual descent due to fuel depletion, or a more abrupt, deliberate act of lowering the plane and colliding with the ground? This is crucial to understanding the motives. Clearly, the person at the controls throughout the flight actively and intentionally performed the necessary actions, turning the plane at the right moments, disabling electronics, and moving as far as possible from radar coverage. Is it possible that at the final stage, this person just passively waited for the plane to run out of fuel? However, according to some calculations, the plane gradually descended rather than being sharply directed downward. At the same time, other calculations suggest the exact opposite. What we know almost for sure is that the last hours of Flight MH370 took place in daylight. This means that the person at the controls, most likely the only living person on board, watched the beginning of a new day. As of today, the investigation into the incident and the search for Flight MH370 have been suspended. No bodies have been found, and no debris other than those 20 fragments that do not clarify the situation. This means that neither the relatives of the passengers nor the rest of the world know the exact reasons and circumstances of the crash. The only hope for knowing the final truth is to find more debris from Flight MH370. However, considering the vast ocean area that needs to be explored and the hundreds of millions of dollars required, the prospect of resuming the search is rather unlikely. The case of Flight MH370 is likely to remain one of the greatest mysteries in aviation history.